there's this decade of the aughts from 2001 to 2007-8 had a characteristic that was very unusual, which is that at a global level, we had a group of deficit countries who were borrowing very heavily to finance current consumption. And so economic growth in these deficit countries, which would be the US, the UK, and then peripheral Europe and a number of countries in the emerging markets, are heavy borrowers. And most of that borrowing, for a variety of reasons that vary from place to place, is going into current consumption. And that's what's fueling their economic growth. And then there's another large group of countries that are running very substantial surpluses, led, of course, by Germany, Japan, and China. And in their case, the motor of economic growth in the decade is producing manufactured exports for the consuming countries. And ironically, they're also lending the consumers the money to buy their products. So this is the sort of the global macroeconomic imbalances that developed in the course of the late 90s, early aughts. And so when all of that comes crashing down, it has the same effect that Rogoff and Reinhardt and others have pointed out in previous debt crises, which it leaves both the creditors and the debtors with some very serious problems, having to deal with balance sheets on the creditor side, balance sheets that are now really questionable, and on the debtor side with a debt burden, a debt overhang that really impedes not only recovery but broader economic growth. Right? So that was the core analytical point is, if you want to think about this crisis, think of it as a debt crisis. Think Mexico 1982, Thailand 1997, Russia 1998. Right? Those are the comparisons we should be drawing, both in the run-up to the crisis and in the aftermath of the crisis, which is not, I must admit, it's not all that flattering, because it indicates that it's not just poor or developing countries that can get themselves in this kind of difficulty. And it's not all that optimistic, because we know, both statistically and more analytically, that the recovery from a debt crisis of this sort is very slow and very long. So that was that, more or less. Right. I didn't go into a lot. I spent a lot more time on the U.S. than I did on Europe. I didn't go into a lot of detail about Europe.
You hit the main point 90% of the time. So.
Pardon me?
I think you hit the main point.
Okay,
of the time,
good.
So.
Good. So, hit the high notes. So, what are the questions, observations, comments?
So, where are we now, in your perspective?
We, the U.S.
We, the U.S., and then we, the world.
The world, yeah. So, I think the U.S. is still one of the reasons that the recovery has been so sluggish is that some of the underlying sources of the problem have not been addressed. So, actually, let me start with Europe, because it sets the stage. So what is it that's the core problem in Europe is that you have several $1 trillion in sovereign debts. In the European case, there's a lot of sovereign debt, government debt. So several $1 trillion in sovereign debt, which everybody knows is not going to be paid off 100 cents on the dollar or 100 cents on the euro. Right? Everybody knows that the market value of that debt, or the real value of that debt, is well below par. But there's been such political gridlock over the restructuring of the debt that there's tremendous uncertainty about what's eventually going to happen. And whether from the creditor side or from the debtor side, that uncertainty really retards the kinds of things that can get growth going again. It retards investment, it retards new lending, retards consumption. The way the Europeans have dealt with it, I think, is problematic, because rather than, if you had a benevolent dictator, I think a consensus of economic observers and analysts would say, a benevolent dictator would say, okay, we're going to take this debt, we're going to write it down to some amount, Greece to 40 cents on the dollar, Italy to 90 cents on the dollar, Spain to 80 cents on the dollar. We're going to write it down, the creditors take the losses, the debtors now have to service it to the restructured amount, and you move forward on that basis. But at this point, no one knows what the value of the debt is. No one knows what's going to happen, so the alternative that they've unfortunately migrated towards is the creditors insist on severe austerity measures in the debtors so that they can prove that they actually are going to try to service their debt. The austerity measures make it that much more difficult to service the debt, and so they get into a sort of a vicious circle or a downward spiral where the more austerity measures are imposed, the more political opposition arises in the debtor countries, the more political opposition arises, the more the creditors say, well, they're not going to be able to service this debt as we would like them to. And they get into the kind of standoff that characterized, again, to draw a comparison, that characterized U.S.-Latin American relations in the 80s. So the analogy I would draw would be, which is the biggest debt crisis in a global sense that we've had since the war, since the 30s, is, after August of '82, pretty much all of the Latin American countries defaulted. And at that point, it was clear to everyone that that was not going to be serviced. That was going to be serviced at some level, but it wasn't going to be serviced as contracted. And the U.S., the banks, and the administration of the U.S. pretended that the debt was good and said, no, you have to adjust to the Latin American countries. And Latin American countries were not willing to say, we're not going to service the debt, because then you're really in trouble. Then you're not going to be able to set up programs with the fund. You're not going to get new money. You're not going to be able to roll over your existing debts. So the banks rolled over with the forbearance of American regulators. They rolled over these bad debts, pretending they were good. The banks, of course, didn't want anything to do with Latin America anymore, so they only rolled them over in order to keep the game going. The Latin Americans imposed more and more austerity, and there was tremendous political unrest throughout the continent. Ironically, a lot of this is political unrest that led to democratization, because it was mostly authoritarian regimes that had incurred the debt. So the guys that got thrown out of office were the dictators who had made a lot of these bad decisions. So this went on for 7 years, until 1989. And finally, in 1989, the American administration, said, this is ridiculous. Our banks still are getting paid back. It's putting real crimp in the global operations of American banks, because we're pretending that this debt is good, when they know it's not. And it's also had these very detrimental effects on Latin American growth, which hurts us because it's a big export and investment market. So let's bite the bullet. And they did with Brady bonds. And essentially what the Brady bonds did was write down the debt to, depending on the country, to 70 cents on the dollar. Depends on how you calculate it, 60, 70, 75 cents on the dollar. But collateralize it so that there wasn't any question about it being paid off. And that essentially solved the problem. But that's after 7 or 8 years of incredibly slow growth in Latin America. Actually, not only slow growth, negative growth in Latin America. So that was the first lost decade, right? Negative growth in Latin America, and a real hindrance to the international operations of American financial institutions. So Europe is sort of facing the same conundrum. I mean, the Northern European creditors are unwilling to, what they're arguing over is who's going to take the hit. All right? So the Northern European creditors are saying, this is your problem. You did all this irresponsible borrowing. You've got to work it out, and that's where the demand for austerity comes from. And the peripheral European debtors are saying, well, they should be saying, they aren't saying, but I'm saying, well, for every irresponsible borrower, there's an irresponsible lender. So the ethics of this is not all that clear. And the fact is that this is going to be a workout, and any workout involves sacrifices on both sides. So it can't just be us; it has to be you too. But if you're the German government, the last thing you want to do is go to your taxpayers and say we need to bail out the German banks because they made bad loans to Greece and Spain and Portugal and Ireland. So there's sort of a gridlock there that has really retarded recovery. And the gridlock is much more severe there than it is here. So the reason I did Europe first is. This is a long-winded answer. All my answers are long-winded, I'm warning. Is that the contrast is a lot starker in Europe because you've got a few major financial institutions from the lending countries, and it's mostly sovereign debt at this point that's being argued over, even though in its origin it wasn't sovereign. I mean, the Spanish borrowing was entirely private, but then the government ended up assuming a lot of it because of the crisis. And because of the demands of the creditors, actually. It wasn't the creditors say, listen, this is Spanish debt, you got to take it over. In the US, the debt problem is not a bunch of banks and 5 or 6 or 7 countries. It's a bunch of banks and 30 million mortgage holders. And so it's a lot harder to restructure 30 million mortgages than to restructure Spanish sovereign debt or Portuguese sovereign debt. And that's really the underlying problem in the US, is that we have gone in that direction, but we really haven't bitten the bullet of thinking about how you restructure what are essentially unpayable debts of a large number of mortgage holders. Not all mortgage holders. I mean, I think the current estimate is that about 1/5 of all mortgages are underwater. So an underwater mortgage, I mean, it's possible in net present value terms, an underwater mortgage should be restructured so that the value of the debt is at least does not exceed the value of the home, right? I mean, this is a definition of a bad loan is one where the collateral is worth less than the loan, right? So an underwater mortgage, if we think of underwater mortgages in normal financial terms, these are bad debts, right? And people say, well, but housing prices are rising and eventually they'll get above water. But you could say that about, just to take an example, Chrysler when it was bankrupt, right? When Chrysler was bankrupt, you could say, and people did say, I mean, they would say, well, just give us 5 more years and we'll rebuild the corporation. But that's not how financial markets work, and it's not how you restore confidence in either a financial institution on the creditor side or on the debtors on the debtor side. What you do is you restructure. As I said yesterday, we have bankruptcy courts in Chapter 11 for a reason, because it is a Pareto improvement. It's it's mutually beneficial to both the creditors and the debtors to take unserviceable debts and restructure them so that they are serviceable in a more credible way. So if I were the benevolent dictator, or if I were omnipotent, or if Bernanke were omnipotent, what he would want to do is take all the underwater mortgages and forcibly restructure them down to some fraction of the actual value of the home, and then start the clock again and have the banks take their losses, which they could easily do. I mean, you're not talking about. I mean, in the first instance, this might have been a real problem, but at this point, they take their losses, and maybe some banks go out of business, but most of them can take the hit. They're doing pretty well these days, right? And then then you restart the clock, and it deals with a lot of the issues associated with the debt overhang. But what is holding things up, both on the consumer side and on the creditor side, is the uncertainty associated with the balance sheets. I mean, the deleveraging process is hampered by the great uncertainty about what's going to happen on the consumer side of the mortgage market. So that's the way I would think about it. See if there was something else I wanted to say. Early on, a lot of people, including me, were sort of saying both predictively and prescriptively that the U.S. was likely to deal with its debts, whether private or public, the old-fashioned way, by inflating them away. And I think at a certain level, without saying it, that's what the Fed would like to do. I mean, what the Fed has been trying to do, really, that's what quantitative easing is all about. It's people talk about, well, quantitative easing is meant to avoid deflation, which is certainly true, but it's also meant to get the price level up. And they've been pretty specific about this, to get it up to or above 3%, especially with the latest announcements that they're targeting nominal GDP. Right? So the idea is, I mean, the hidden agenda there is, if we can have 3 or 4 or 5 years of 2, 3, 4% inflation, then the real debt burden goes down by 15 or 20% and makes it more manageable. It's not the most efficient way to deal with it, right? But in an environment in which fiscal policy is essentially hamstrung by political gridlock, monetary policy is the only game in town. This is what it is, as they say in New England.
Fiscal policy should not be, in these times, fiscal policy would be the better instrument to use. So it's sad that it is walked down this way.
I mean, it's well, you had a, I don't know, you were.
No, go on.
Yeah, I mean, without getting into the ideological and other conflicts over fiscal policy, it's certainly the case that the standard consensus kind of reaction would be, well, fiscal policy of one way or another. I mean, there are different ways of using fiscal policy in an environment like this. You can use fiscal policy in a directed way to deal with the debts. You can use fiscal policy in a general way to stimulate consumption. And we did that. I mean, one of the differences between the Europeans and the U.S. is that for a variety of reasons, we actually had a fairly substantial fiscal stimulus. I mean, people can argue whether it was excessive or insufficient, but we had a fairly substantial one early on. And the Europeans had very little. they had mostly just their automatic stabilizers kick in. And that was because the countries that were most directly affected by the crisis weren't able to borrow. So if you're Spain and you hit a wall, what you would have wanted to do, thinking of Europe as a whole, you would want Europe as a whole to undertake more fiscal stimulus, but the Germans weren't going to do that because they were still growing. And the debtor countries couldn't do it because they couldn't borrow. So we had a more successful experience with the fiscal stimulus, but what happened, unfortunately, is that the political debates over, which are real and reasonable, over the long-term fiscal problems of the U.S., which are real, got mixed in with debate over the short-term fiscal stance of the government, and that's, to me, is very, very unfortunate. I think that, in economic policy, like in so much else, timing is everything, and people are arguing now about the fiscal position of the U.S. government over a 20-year horizon when they should be arguing over this year and next year. And the sequester is an example of this. The sequester, it may be a good idea in the long run to force across-the-board cuts or across-the-board revenue increases or something along those lines, but it's not a good idea now, right? When we still have unemployment approaching 8% and when the recovery is still very weak. So, but it's ironic because the U.S., which has long-term fiscal problems, is arguing over short-term fiscal issues. And the Europeans, who have short-term fiscal problems, are arguing over long-term structural issues, like how do you set up a banking union or a fiscal union for the European Union. So in both cases, I think it's because you have very powerful conflicting interests. In both cases, the nature of the debate that's going on takes away from more effectively dealing with the current problems, but it represents the powerful interests at stake. You have, in the European case, the Northern Europeans want the European Union, or the Eurozone at least, to be restructured. The Southern Europeans want in one way, the Southern Europeans want to be restructured in a different way. In the U.S., we have the Republicans who would like a restructuring of public finances in one direction and the Democrats in another direction. And because you have these very strong set positions, even if they're arguing about things that are not really about, that if they're faced with a circumstance which is not really about these broader structural disagreements, they end up arguing over. So, now the Democrats and Republicans are arguing over the shape of the sequester. That's, the amount of money involved is trivial relative to the overall fiscal problem the U.S. faces, but it has become symbolic, right? The Republicans want to draw a line in the sand saying the way to solve this problem is to deal with benefits and entitlements, spending, and the Republicans want to say that, and the Democrats want to say, yes, but we also have to deal with revenue, and so everything gets tied up in that.
Interesting things that you mentioned about Canada is how the housing market in Canada is still going strong. Mm-hmm. We had a different consequence because somewhere in our regulatory system, we have loopholes and the financial system is seeking to do different things. Mm-hmm. But the countries that had stronger regimes in terms of the way they wrote their laws did not find themselves in the same financial mess.
Well, regulation certainly plays a role, but I have a somewhat different view, which is to say, if you want to try to find the underlying cause of these things, I think of it from the standpoint of the capital inflows, right? So so what differentiates the U.S. from Canada? Well, yes, it's true that Canada had tighter regulation than the U.S., but Canada is not a big borrower in this period. It's essentially either mild surplus, mild deficits, but it's close to balance. And to the extent that Australia is a big borrower, but to the extent that it's borrowing for productive purposes. In the case of Canada, the borrowing is going into the development of the shale oil and gas fields on the prairies. In Australia, it's going into the development of the primary commodities of the raw materials sector. In peripheral Europe and the U.S., the borrowing is almost exclusively going into government debt or the housing market, household borrowing, that is current consumption. So here's the way I would think about it. You have the funds are made available. Financial institutions want to lend them out. And so let me give you a comparison here. Spain had even tighter regulation than Canada, had the tightest financial regulations in the OECD. And yet they have an even bigger crisis. And why? Because as the funds start flowing into Spain, the Spanish banks, most of these funds are intermediated by the domestic financial institutions. So the Spanish banks say, listen, they go to the regulator and say, listen, we're getting hundreds of billions of dollars that at below the rate of inflation. We've got a booming economy. We want to lend it out. You're going to have to relax these regulations. So it's the inflow of funds, the availability of these funds that leads the financial institutions to pressure for the regulations to be relaxed, which they eventually were. But even in the instances in which they weren't relaxed, in the case of Spain, the fact is that the money was lent out because it was just too attractive for the banks to borrow and then on-lend domestically. So you mentioned China. The relationship, the European interaction is a little different than the U.S.-China interaction. The European one is in large part, or is closely related to the characteristics of the Eurozone. And the fact that, I mean, there are a lot of things about the Eurozone that people recognize would cause difficulties. One of them was that you have a common monetary policy for different macroeconomic conditions. And at the time the euro was introduced in 98, 99, Germany is stagnant. Real wages have declined over the course of the 90s. And the country has purposely restrained wages and consumption in order to encourage investment and exports, while Spain, Italy, Portugal, peripheral, in the East, Central, and Eastern European countries are growing very rapidly. So you've got essentially no inflation, about 0.5% inflation in Germany, and 3 or 4% inflation in the peripheral European countries because they're going around sort of the Lasse-Samuelson effect. They're growing very rapidly. Well, the ECB has to set an interest rate for all of the Eurozone, so they set it sort of in the middle. And what that means is that real interest rates are maybe 1.5%, 2% in Germany, but they're negative in Spain, just to take Spain and Germany. So there are tremendous incentives to borrow in Spain, and funds flow immediately, start flowing from Germany to Spain. And the flow of funds actually exacerbates the process because as more money floods into Spain, prices start rising further and further in Spain, making it even more attractive to borrow, especially if you're in housing, right? And so it's a self-reinforcing prophecy or a self-reinforcing process until, of course, the bubble bursts and everything comes crashing down. That's not so much the case in the US because we're not a common currency with China, but there's a similarity in the sense that the Chinese money is flooding into the U.S. I mean, we're borrowing heavily from China. We're also borrowing from other countries or from other sources. There are different kinds of reasons for the sources. The borrowing from China is going almost exclusively into Treasury securities and other GSEs. And the reason for that money coming into the U.S. is largely because the Chinese are using it to keep the renminbi relatively weak as part of their overall growth strategy. So they're not really, the Chinese money is not, the Chinese, or more broadly the East Asian money, is not seeking yield. It's essentially looking for a place to park these funds. But that has the effect of driving the yield on Treasury securities way down. So, but because the Chinese funds are flooding into the U.S., Treasury securities drop really below inflation at some point. And that means that other investors, like the Germans, so a lot of the money is coming in from Germany or from Northern Europe more generally, so the value-seeking investors move out of Treasury securities and related securities and start looking for other ways to make money. And that's where the incentives are for the financial engineers to say, okay, we can find you a deal on the housing market. And they find these clever ways of repackaging bad loans as if they were good loans and selling them to the Europeans. And you say people didn't know. It's true that there's an opacity to the process, but I think it is the case that, that whether it was Goldman Sachs or the eventual German or Dutch or Swedish or Japanese investors knew that lending to American homeowners was riskier than lending to the U.S. government, right? Or going into equities in the stock market. So yes, it's true that there was some that some of the financial institutions misled the investors, but I think that that's been taken too far. What is true is that the highly complex nature of these financially engineered products, so the securitized mortgages, made it very difficult. If you were a conscientious investor, a Dutch pension fund or something, you couldn't know the underlying quality of the assets because there are just too many steps between the mortgages and the securitized or the derivatives based on securitized mortgages that you're buying. And you're under a lot of pressure to buy these things because people benchmark. So if you're a Dutch pension fund manager and you're only earning 3% on your American investments, and your constituents, you know, the unions or whoever it is, say, gee, how come the Germans are earning 6% and you're only earning 3%? And you say, because we think these are bad bets. And they say, well, wait a second, they're earning 6% and they know what they're doing, so why don't... So there's a sort of herding behavior as the financial institutions try to match each other's benchmarks. So there's that aspect of it as well. But again, I would go back to where I think the sort of the primum mobile is, the prime mover of these things, which is the capital flows. I'm of the view that if you want to understand the process, you look at the global capital flows as sort of what then changes the incentives of the various actors, whether on the borrowing side or the lending side, and leads to a lot of this, what turns out to be very risky behavior. And again, this is not a new story. This is the story of the 1920s or the 1890s or the 1870s or the 1820s or the 1980s, right? You know, there are all these funny stories about lending in the 19th century where people float bonds of countries that don't exist on the London market because it takes a long time for news to get back from Latin America to London. And we don't have people floating bonds of non-existent countries anymore, but we do have people floating bonds of non-existent mortgages, I suppose. So that's the way I think about it.
In one of the documentaries I show, I think it's CNBC's House of Cards.
Oh, yeah.
They talk about Narvik, Norway, where people in one of these countries that has the knowledge, Northern European and differently structured, were making these same bad moves like people in Southern Europe and other places. So at the national level, we might have a census, so we don't want this kind of thing, but when the city of Narvik is saying, yeah, we're going to buy these securitized things and use it as an investment for the future, etc., it is still possible for these guys to sell to various not so informed places.
Sure. Well, that's the benchmark.
This is a good
thing. You know, if you're, I mean, there are a lot of American towns. I think what's, I think it's in Washington County, not Washington County, King County in Washington they had a financial manager, and you know, state, local governments invest funds because they have funds on hand, and so the library system bought a bunch of these securitized mortgages, and they got destroyed, hammered when it all came crashing down. But again, why are they doing it? It's a lack of information, but it's also because they see. I mean, when you're looking, if you're a fund manager and you're earning, you know, way below what other people are earning, you say, get it up to par, get it up. You know, so there's this pressure. What encourages this kind of herding behavior in financial markets, both on the borrowing side and on the lending side, is that people see the rate of return on other people's investments and they want to match that, and they tend, for whatever reason, to lose track of the fact that typically when the return is higher, it's because the risk is higher. Right? All they see is the return; they don't see the risk.
We should probably stop it there. I didn't want to make sure we get to the car in time.
Oh, okay.
At the right moment. I'm sorry to cut it off right there.
Well,
but
thank you.
We
Thank
don't
you
want to be
very
late.
much. All right.
Well, you can ask your question anyway.
Yeah, I just want to ask questions. Do you have a, like, say if you have a crystal ball, you see in there.
I like
Assume a crystal ball.
Yeah, okay, assume we have a crystal ball. Will the United States ever get back to be the top player in the world?
Well, it already is, in the sense that it's the biggest
Like,
economy.
but for the next several years, and China's going to take over.
It's all, but China's still a very poor country. I mean, it's a big economy, but it's still very poor. I think that for the foreseeable future, the U.S. is still top dog. You know, I mean, our financial markets are as bad as, I mean, one of the reasons the U.S. is still a safe haven is that, you know, it's better than all the others. You know, if you're an international investor, you know, you don't want to go to Europe because it's in bad shape. You don't want to go to Japan, it's in bad shape. The U.S. is still better than all the rest. So
the next question is, will this strategy of borrowing to grow ever stop, or just keep going?
My hope is, I think that it's a very unstable, I mean, this is some part of what I was talking about towards the end of the talk yesterday, is that we live in a world of enormous financial markets, enormous and tightly integrated financial markets. And neither national policymakers nor international institutions have really adjusted to that reality. It's incredibly easy for, international credit markets operate on a rationing basis. That is, either you can borrow or you can't. And if you can borrow for almost nothing. So that means that, today, countries like Peru can borrow for only, like 30 basis points more than the US. That's insane, right? And in their own currency, right? So, that might be a good thing if you're Peruvian, but the problem is that the incentives it gives to either private or public borrowers in these countries is to engage in more borrowing that probably makes sense. And so another way to think about it, if you want to think of it in sort of straightforward neoclassical terms, is individual borrowers at the national level, right, in some sense impose an externality on others. So, and this goes back to discussions of Chile in the 1970s. All the Chilean borrowing in the 70s was done by private agents. But every 10 or $20 million borrowed by Chilean private agents reduced the creditworthiness of all Chilean borrowers because it increased the likelihood of a banking crisis or a currency crisis, which is a national thing. So the Chileans responded. The most neoclassical of all policymakers responded by taxing capital inflows because they said, look, borrowers are imposing externalities on the rest of the economy. The way you internalize those externalities is by taxing the capital inflows. But very few countries do that. So another way of putting it is that every American mortgage holder or every Spanish mortgage holder that borrowed in the last 10 years was increasing the likelihood of a financial crisis in the US and therefore was imposing an externality on other Americans. And we have no way of internalizing that. Or in the case of Europe, every bit of borrowing by a public sector entity in Spain or Portugal or Greece was imposing externalities on the rest of Europe because of the integrated financial markets, and that was not compensated, that was not charged. So we have an international financial system in which borrowing creates problems, but we don't have an ex-ante way of trying to encourage behavior that creates fewer problems or that builds up a reserve that allows you to address those problems once the problems arise. And so my hope is that over time, that whether in the form of global cooperation on these lines or changes in national policy or the development of international institutions, that there will be ways developed to try to manage these capital flows in a more appropriate way. We don't have them now.
Okay. So I think that has just depend on our generation.
The answer is the usual social science answer. It depends. Right.